that's outside that box.
Yep.
Right. Again, that doesn't mean that the things that you care about in terms of what's orthodox and what's true, that doesn't mean that those things are illegitimate. It just means that, to put it simply, people are often more complex than our culture war politics allows for. And oftentimes we are working in our own minds with a kind of archetype of the spiritual human being that just doesn't exist. And we are imposing that standard in ways that we ourselves don't abide by. Right. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode on Relentless Pursuit of Purpose, where our goal is to help you enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. If you've not already done so, please make sure and hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a video or an interview such as we have tonight. I'm excited. I've been trying to get this going for a little while now. Had an opportunity to meet Steve. Was it this year or last year? I can't remember anymore.
It was earlier this year.
Time is there's a lot going on. So yeah, I'm excited to have you join us. And this is an area that I love history, but I'm not a Harvard trained historian. So wanted to bring one on and kind of help us unpack some things that are pertinent for today, because the past helps us with the future, or with the present, I should say. So first, can you just kind of introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Sure. Well, thank you, Alex, for having me. It's been a minute. We've been trying to get this going. It's been my fault as well. And so I want to make sure your viewers know the real deal. It's been me, but you've been exceedingly gracious, and been looking forward to this for a while. So yeah, my name is Stephen Harris. Currently I'm wearing several hats, but most importantly, I think my work at Georgetown University, out of a center there called the Center on Faith and Justice. I help kind of run academic programs, thinking about not just equipping students to think about the intersection of faith and public life, but then also externally from the site of Georgetown, helping the broader DC community think about that intersection, and of course, kind of still having some relationship with public policy discussions and things like that, because I have a background in faith-based public policy advocacy. So I did that for several years before my time at Georgetown. Throughout all of this, I've also been a grad student at Harvard, trying to finish a PhD in American religious history and African American studies. And so that's been the past several years. I've been doing that as well. So those are the main couple of hats that I wear. Beyond that, I'm a husband and a father here right outside of DC at a great local church near our home, and just trying to stay local, stay grounded, and stay faithful.
Amen. Yeah, I don't know if I remembered this until you just said that, because I'm actually originally from DC.
Okay.
And then grew up in Maryland and Virginia. So you're back in my stomping grounds.
So if this place has a pull on people, for folks who either are from here or they come here and they can't find a way to leave, they just end up staying around.
Yeah, well, being the nation's capital, it has that effect on some.
That's exactly what it is.
And so actually, let me start there before we even really get into everything, because you said you had this background in faith and public policy. Mm-hmm. What did that look like? What were some of the initiatives that you were involved in?
Yeah, so my first master's was a Master of Divinity degree at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And that was there in Louisville, Kentucky. So spent several years in Kentucky, did some pastoral ministry in Kentucky. But my ethics professor was a man named Russell Moore, who for several years was both a faculty member at Southern Seminary, but then ended up leading the public policy arm of the denomination, which was called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And so I came on board in many ways in the DC office to help fill out a kind of justice portfolio, trying to connect the denominational aims and interests to issues that were being discussed on Capitol Hill, kind of current issues. And so for me, most of my time was spent on issues like payday lending, international religious freedom, criminal justice reform, immigration reform, and a range of others. But it was kind of my first initial experience with a kind of formal intersection of religion and public policy, and that included just a lot of coalition participation, coalition building, obviously trying to articulate a particular position on issues from a faith-informed perspective, trying to give an analysis of the moral and ethical implications of public policy that are oftentimes either flying under the radar or totally just, they're just not in the picture, not in the picture most of the time. And so what does it mean to bring that kind of perspective to that space? And to make the argument that many citizens, constituents, right, are trying to order their lives, live their lives according to particular values and convictions that they have, right? And so what does it mean to bring that language into that space so that as public policy is being debated, that we are not missing that kind of level of the analysis? And learned a lot, right? Learned a lot about, of course, how public policy gets kind of done in that space, the challenges, the politics of it all, and saw a lot in terms of how the language of faith, how faith communities are seen and represented or not. And the challenges around trying to both hold a particular authentic kind of faithful position, but then bring it into, again, conversation in a space like that, where in many ways, right, the temptation, as is always the case in that space, is to allow political expediency, political priority, political preference to be the driver of the faith perspective, right, rather than the other way around. So what does that relationship look like? And then how do we talk about in a kind of plural public space, public and political space rather, the relationship between faith and public policy, faith communities and public policy? What exactly are we trying to commend? So the language of common good, the language of human flourishing, human dignity, human rights, all these things become tools in order to articulate and bring to a kind of plural space what we might be trying to commend as a benefit for all individuals, not just individuals of particular faith traditions, right? So that kind of challenge, thinking about the kind of religiously plural present and past that we've aspired to in this country. So those bring challenges to that space, but learned a lot. I think accomplished some good things. One of the things you realize very quickly doing work on Capitol Hill is that public policy moves slowly, particularly depending on what issues you're talking about. Things are just not getting passed every day, and so there are a lot of individuals who are doing good patient work, trying to make a case for particular views on issues that impact people's everyday lives. And I did that for about 5 years, and quickly felt the kind of burden and in many ways the burnout that comes with rehearsing and regurgitating issues and arguments and perspectives over and over again, seemingly to no avail. And so it was a season of enlightenment in many ways that really forced me to press even deeper into the historical work that I do, the historical inquiry that I have, as I try to think about kind of our present crises, our present realities. So there's more I can say about that.
No, that's a lot right there. Man, we can do a whole episode just on that.
Yeah.
But that's actually a good segue into my first question, and just to kind of set the stage for everybody who's not a Harvard trained historian. How should we engage in historical research? Because I do a lot of work in philosophy, and your epistemology in some ways and in some instances will determine the ontological conclusion that you reach. Sure. In other words, how you come to know something often affects how you see what you come to know, or what you think you come to know. Yeah. And there are guardrails in historical research. explanatory scope, explanatory power, go on and on. But what would you say are some kind of guardrails that we should have as we're reading and examining history?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that I think, particularly thinking about our current moment, that would be helpful. And it's unfortunate that some of these things have become as controversial as they have been. One, a deep awareness of one's own positionality. Situated knowledge is a kind of scholarly phrase by.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, and I'm drawing from, misremember her first name, but Haraway is the last name of the author who wrote this very compelling piece on situated knowledges, basically making the claim that, again, shouldn't be all that controversial, but that knowledge claims, even our attempt at articulating truth claims, even truth claims that we hold to be objectively true, right? That ought not preclude one from being aware and being honest about the contextual position that they hold as they are articulating that claim, right? Or another way to put it would be the idea that I am espousing knowledge or making a claim from kind of an objective nowhere. It's an ideal, certainly, but in reality, my social context, my economic realities, a whole host of things are influencing and informing, perhaps in subtle ways, how I hold a particular claim. It's influencing how I think about that particular claim. It's influencing how I even talk about a particular claim, right? And so the idea that knowledges are situated is a reminder that they are emerging from particular social contexts. And to be aware of one's positionality as they go about trying to do the work of historical inquiry is immensely important, right? I think part of the pushback from that is, well, if I cede some kind of ground to the notion that I am arriving at this project from some subjective space, then that is going to prevent me from being able to make objective claims, right? And what I want to suggest is, it's actually, ironically, it's one's unwillingness to admit that they are standing on a particular ground, particular social context, that is going to ultimately call into question the objective claims that you're seeking to espouse, right? So in other words, I'm advocating for a kind of honesty. That I believe X, Y, and Z. I believe this to be true, and I believe these things to be true, even as I acknowledge and admit that I am operating from this kind of social context. I have these kind of influences, etc. Right? I think that gives a more authentic and genuine ear to those who you're trying to commend, whatever you're trying to commend, whatever you're trying to commend to those of your interlocutors. But back to did you want to interject?
No, I was saying it's a more humble approach is basically what you're saying.
It's a more humble approach, right? And so just acknowledging one's situatedness is important, because, and I say this for this reason. We think about history, the art of history. If you study the kind of art of history making, they call that historiography, which is the history of history making. You begin to see very quickly, right? Like, history making is merely individuals deciding on what kind of, to use your phrase, kind of scope they're taking, what kind of frame, what their own periodization. So I can write a history about the 19th century that is largely what we call kind of top down. I'm looking at maybe political leaders, or I'm looking at governmental leaders, right? That is going to lend itself to a particular kind of narrative, right? Or I can write a history that is more from the ground up. I'm looking at social history. I'm doing kind of anthropological work, looking at how people interact in their kind of on the ground everyday lives. That's gonna read a very different narrative. And I could be talking about the same period, right? And so it's important for the one who is, again, inquiring about history, to be aware of where they're looking. And when that awareness of where I'm looking then cue me into, okay, what am I not looking at that perhaps might fill in a picture of this particular period or even event that I'm interested in. The last thing I'll say, and I'll let you come back in. One of the things that I'm very sensitive about as we think about the history of religion and race is how you can very concretely see differences of history making just from the different lenses and vantage points of different peoples, right? Mm-hmm. And there's an anecdote I can give about this that kind of opens this up. During the histories that were written about the slave period. Think about early histories. You might have as a primary source, is another thing I say about primary sources that are important. A primary source would be, maybe like a slave owner diary. And they're writing about particular realities that occurred on a day-by-day basis on their plantation. And in the slave diary, you see a repetition of an account where the slave master is increasingly frustrated because day by day, the enslaved are finding it difficult to operate plantation machinery to the point that the machinery ends up being broken every day. And so the slave master is increasingly frustrated because they have to use resources to fix machines, right? I can take that primary source and write a history maybe about a slave plantation or about a slave master family or whatever. And I can draw certain conclusions about that based off of that diary and this literally happened. Well, this is a demonstration of the inferior intellectual capabilities of African slaves, right? They were unable to figure out how to operate machinery. Or I can take that primary source and do what's called read it against its grain and ask questions. Okay, well, what else might be going on here, right? And so another historian can take that same primary source and read it in a different lens from the vantage point of a different perspective and come to another conclusion. And the conclusion that we see in the history and the literature is that, oh no, they're breaking these machines on purpose, right? That it's actually not a reflection of an inferior intellectual capability. They are actually intentionally doing violence to the instruments that are serving as the tools of their oppression. And thereby in a very kind of short-circuiting the institution and the master-slave relationship and willfully bearing in their own bodies the consequences of that, right? But that's an entirely different narrative that brings in questions of agency and all these kind of things, right? So that's just an example. If you look at a singular primary source and read it in a number of different ways. The last thing I'll say on that is primary sources are critical. And what I mean by primary sources is when I'm interested in historical inquiry, how am I bringing myself to confront the actual, whether it's archival documents, the actual artifacts from that period? Oftentimes when individuals say they're reading history or looking into history, typically what they're reading are secondary sources, which are not bad. They're great. They're great secondary source works. But by secondary sources, I mean, you're reading the work of individuals who went and looked at primary sources and put together a narrative. You're reading their take on that period or that event, right? Right. Rather than reading the sources yourself, right? That's the kind of another level of inquiry that I want to always encourage people to take. Read the primary source yourself and come to your own analysis. But those are just
Unfortunately, that's a rarity today with the internet and social media.
Yeah.
People just want to post and not fact check and, definitely not go to a primary source, barely a secondary. So, oh man. But that's really helpful because, I remember reading talking about examining your horizon and your bias is kind of what you're talking about. And I think Mike Lacona was writing about that. So just the way you said, it's more humble to do what you're saying. It's actually quite arrogant to not do it. So I read a lot, but I read a lot of stuff that I know I'm not going to agree with. And I do that on purpose.
If I just say a word on that, right?
Yeah.
I think that's critically important. Because again, it helps guard me from those kind of biases, right? Part of, there was, I was recently reading some things on the Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era has its own, there's an entire historiography of Reconstruction era historical writing. So much so that there is a particular school of thought that reigned supreme for a while, and then there was a revisionist school of thought that reigned supreme. In other words, again, particular ways of seeing that period,
right,
and then a different vantage point from seeing that period. It's important to be aware of these things so that I don't too quickly take a particular vantage point as the historical reality. There are always decisions that have been made. There are always emphases that are being made, and then therefore other things that are being left out.
Right.
You know? And so it protects us from those kind of biases.
Yeah. Have you read the book? I think I read it last year. It's called The Myth of the Lost Cause.
I've heard about this work. And the reason why I ended up looking in it is because, and this might have been the debate over the historical motivations, right? There's it's been one of the sites of our kind of current contemporary debate about history, right? Motivations for the Civil War and motivations for this and that. And it has caused this kind of public inquiry. In many ways, you've seen this kind of play out on social media, which maybe not be the best media for it, but you've seen these kind of debates, right? And individuals kind of interrogating historical works. But there's a whole host of other things that we're debating in our contemporary moment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I thought it was really good. So it's a great secondary, but he's the whole book is pretty much quoting primary source documents on both sides. So that's really helpful. So as we have that framework laid, I was looking at your bio, and it says that his interests lie at the historical intersection of antebellum Black religious thought and Calvinistic theology.
Yeah.
What? How did we get there?
No, it's been a long journey there to that point. It's kind of been under development for a while. Okay. So my first master's, as I said, was at Southern Seminary in Louisville, which is a very distinctly and proudly kind of Calvinistic space.
That's Mohler. Is that
Al Mohler has been president for a while, but just very much so that is the kind of theological preference, reigning preference there. And being in that space that's just so kind of heavily kind of bathed in Reformed theology, Reformed thought. Many people having not read the Institutes, which is again another thing, right? Not at the professor level, but at the student level.
Right.
But I immediately began to ask questions, right? Like, are there any historical intersections between Reformed theology and Black religious thought in the American context? And if so, what did that look like? And where were those historical sites? And so that, I didn't do too much with it there, but those questions began there. And then my second master's at Yale in Black religion, I kind of got a chance to focus exclusively on that question, which brought me to figures like the ones who are going to comprise my dissertation, folks like Phyllis Wheatley, Lemuel Haynes, Jupiter Hammond, and some others, individuals who are working with theological material that we might call Calvinistic, but are interpreting and deploying that material in interesting ways, in liberative ways, in ways that are distinct from their white counterparts. So I'm curious as to, right, like the what and the why of that, and how to talk about that, right? How do you talk about the reception of whether it's a theological tradition or, again, just theological ways of thinking in that context? Phyllis Wheatley is an enslaved African female. How do you talk about theological learning and reception in that context? How do you talk about Black religious thinking in that context? And so I had kind of my figures of interest, but what kind of story am I trying to tell? But even before that, how do I do the good work of trying to excavate the history around these figures when sources are not plenteous, right? So you have to engage in a process of trying to recreate the social worlds in which they're operating, to try to get a sense of how they are interacting with this theological material. Now, in the case of the figures that I've just mentioned, there is a literary trail that they leave. So I'm dealing with Black writers in the North who had the unique opportunity to be educated even as they are enslaved, and therefore they leave a kind of literary trail, a lot of it poetical, but in the case of Haynes, a lot of it just theological prose. He's writing sermons and things of that nature. So that's a rarity.
In those figures you named, did you see in their sermons or writings things that you were able to clue in on as, I don't know, Calvinistic or Reformed?
Yeah. So, for both Wheatley and Haynes, and you see this a little bit in Hammond as well, there is a strong appeal to concepts like divine sovereignty, and Haynes in particular, Lemuel Haynes in particular, he himself is very consciously, he has made choice of what he calls the doctrines of grace. So of all the three that I named, Haynes is the most kind of theologically educated and astute. But so he's consciously making choice of particular theological perspectives. Okay. But you see a strong appeal to divine sovereignty, and providential language, even language of election. But again, what does it mean for an enslaved individual to talk about God having made choice of them, right? Well, they're deploying that in ways that, again, push more of a kind of egalitarian social arrangement, right? Because if an enslaved person is suggesting, no, God made choice, he's elected me, right? And then based off of that is suggesting in very subtle, but I think powerful ways, that this entire hierarchical racial system is illegitimate because of that. I think it's very powerful what we see in these kind of early writings. And in many ways, I suggest that these kind of figures, I think, give us a kind of early example, very distinct and very subtle, but a kind of early example of what will become. So I'm not drawing a kind of strong through line here, but an early example of what will become a kind of full-throated, we can even suggest kind of proto-liberation theology, right?
Yeah, but again, like pre-civil rights mentality.
Yeah, it's making its choice of this very, very unique theological material, right?
Yeah.
And so I can't draw a strong through line between, what Haynes is writing and, what will become the kind of formal advent of liberation theology. But I am suggesting that these Black writers are concerned about the same kinds of questions that will be taken up in a kind of formal way, later, centuries later.
Well, how did you, as you have gone through this process and you've read a lot and you see humanity probably more clearly than a lot of people, because you've seen we haven't really changed much. We're not much better. Unfortunately, I mean, we're better in some ways, but so you're reading these three, but you're also reading George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, considered two of the greatest preachers of their time, but slave owners. Yep. In fact, George Whitefield almost helped initiate slavery. And so as these ideas, and they're both seemingly operating from the same theological framework, but two very different conclusions, even then, so let alone us trying to examine it now from a historical point of view, how did that, I mean, even internally, how did you feel as you read these things and try to make sense of everything, and how can we?
Yeah, well, that's been a journey for me too, because I think early on, my interests were more, and I think this is because I was coming out of Southern, my interests were more concerned with trying to defend a theological tradition, right? So here's this objective theological tradition, and you have, like you said, folks like Edwards and Whitfield pulling from this tradition and making these conclusions. Oh, but look, you have Black religious actors and thinkers pulling from this tradition and making these conclusions. So the problem is in that conclusion making work, not with this pure tradition, right?
Gotcha.
And I'm some of those interests are, I think, legitimate, and that's worthy of discussion. I think the transition that happened for me is, rather than trying to prove that folks like Haynes, Wheatley, or Hammond were legitimate Calvinists, right? I think my interest became, in what ways are they drawing from this theological tradition and material and doing unique things with it? The reason why that's different is not so much what the tradition is doing to them, but what they are doing to the tradition, right? Mm. In other words, the way I kind of worked my way through it is, look, these individuals are wrestling with these ideas and these concepts, and they're trying to make sense of their social world. And in the most immediate sense, they're trying to themselves be participants and, partakers of a kind of spiritual life. Mm-hmm. That all of these concepts are kind of speaking to, right? I often think that gets lost in, we talk about Black religion. I think that often gets lost. We're often more immediately thinking about the functioning of Black religion. In other words, what is religion doing for Black people vis-a-vis white supremacy, social constraints, etc.? I think that's a relevant question. For my figures, I'm often always trying to show in the most immediate sense, they're actually drawing spiritual sustenance from these things. There's a spiritual life, an interiority that they are kind of most immediately concerned with. And then also they're thinking their way through their kind of external social location and context. But yeah, so it became me being more comfortable with thinking about the ways in which they do and do not fit within theological constraints, or what might be deemed theological constraints and categories, right? Mm-hmm. The way that kind of helps me in my contemporary context is I think those same kinds of constraints exist. And I don't think that's all illegitimate, right? I do believe that I do believe that categories like orthodoxy and biblical are legitimate, but oftentimes the way in which these categories are policed have less to do with like promoting a spiritually vital, not relevant, and it has less to do with that, and has more to do with kind of boundary marking in order to figure out who's in and who's out.
Right.
So I have no problem that, someone might look at Haynes or Wheatley or Hammond and say, well, according to the standards of the tradition, they're not really, that's fine. I'm saying they're drawing from this tradition, and they are, interestingly enough, doing the intellectual labor of interpreting and articulating in ways that are distinct from their white counterparts, and that they find useful for both their spiritual life, but also helping them think about the present reality of the social location, right? And what God is doing in terms of that present reality. So I don't know if that's helpful. I still wrestle with a lot of it, but it's a shift in how I've come to think about it.
No, that's really helpful, because I know, just reading so much, even in my master's apologetics, the first two things I had to read were atheist works, David Hume and Antony Flew, which is great, but you can't just read it and move on. You got to wrestle with it and respond to it and think about it, and so that's the work that I think higher education forces us into. So we're trying to give, for those listening, some of the tools and tricks of the trade, so to speak, so that you can do these on your own level. We're all busy. Everybody doesn't have time to go get a PhD. So, but you can still utilize these tools, because to some degree, we all do historical research. Mm-hmm. For some people, that's Wikipedia. For some people, that's a PhD. So it does matter how we engage in these things. And
can I say one more thing to this? And this just popped in my head as you mentioned your reading. I think it also helps us because this is why I was very adamant about the historical projects that I'm interested in, having, gotten a theology degree. The temptation to, again, hold and lift theological categories and concepts as like static things.
Right.
When you then try to apply that to historical realities, you can end up frustrated because you end up doing, you read too much and you're like, oh, well, Edward said what? He ain't supposed to be saying stuff like that. According to right? Like according to the he's never supposed to use that kind of language.
Right.
It's like exactly. Right. Because what you've taken is a category and tradition. And somewhere along the line, you've been told that biblical faithfulness, both historically and contemporarily, looks like this box. But then you went and read the primary source of the figure that you've been told helped create that box. And they saying stuff that's outside that box. Right. Again, that doesn't mean that the things that you care about in terms of what's orthodox and what's true, that doesn't mean that those things are illegitimate. It just means that, to put it simply, people are often more complex than our culture war politics allows for. And oftentimes we are working in our own minds with a kind of archetype of the spiritual human being that just doesn't exist. And we are imposing that standard in ways that we ourselves don't abide by. Right.
No, I'm taking a sigh of deep breath because that's
you read some of Calvin's commentaries.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting he's all over the place, but it's just like he himself reasons in ways that the Calvinist tradition would suggest that a Calvinist never should reason in. Right. It's like, what do you do with that? I'm not saying you throw away the tradition, but I'm saying you kind of humble yourself a little bit and understand that this stuff on the ground lived out doesn't look, nobody's a walking systematics textbook, right? That's just not how people work. And oftentimes what helps is like having done ministry in real people's lives, like you dispense with that very quickly, right? It's like, people just don't work that way.
No. And most people don't care, reform this or that. I'm a pastor. They just need help. Like,
they just need help, and that's the challenge of those of us who care about, theology and doctrine and right thinking and things like that. How do we commend it?
Whew, this is good. So, with that being said, let's go a little further. So we understand that there's barriers, that there's parameters we need to have in place to guard against our own bias or horizon, to do historical research well. I want to talk about the importance of historical context, especially in the West, in America, for the theologically minded in the present. In other words, how does the past inform the present? What's the other slogan in history is that if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat those errors. And I think on the current trend, there are some who, certain people will call the super woke whatever crowd. They're accusing them of going back in history and trying to make those crimes currently punishable in some form or fashion. So both are looking at the history, and one is saying, okay, well, based on that, this must be happening today, or this must happen today. And other people are saying, well, that was the past, this is the present.
Yeah.
How do we I know the middle ground is the right ground, but how do we
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been one of the, I was going to reduce it and use singular language. This is the most thing, but there are other things we could think about that are deeply problematic, but this is definitely one of them, right?
Yeah.
America's own reckoning with its own racial, not just racial past, but just its past. And the reason why I think that's been so difficult is because America in particular is founded on, or at least ostensibly is founded on a particular, it's a kind of theological project. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the early New England colonies, so I'm thinking about the colonial period, the earliest colonies like Massachusetts Bay, what is the project that is imagined to be undertaken at that point, right? It's a continuation in a kind of more perfected form of the product of the Reformation in Europe, right? We want to, and I'm using the we as they would use it. We want to demonstrate to England what it means, the Church of England, what it means to let the Reformation take its fullest, most extensive form, shape, and influence. So we're going to demonstrate basically how you do true church to Church of England, right? And so even in John Winthrop's, famous sermon, whether he gave it on board a ship or whether he gave it before they left or whether he gave it once they landed in Massachusetts Bay, but like if there's a line that says, right, may they say, and the they being the folks who look upon what they're doing in colonial New England, may the world look at what they're doing, and namely how they do church, and say, make it like New England, right? May they serve as that kind of example. And he employs this city on a hill language from the New Testament itself. But this is a theological project, right? And in many ways, the seeds of what we might come to call American exceptionalism are sown in this project. Again, that is ostensibly a theological project. Well, this project over generations, right, turns into a nation-building project, but that those theological foundations metastasize and take on different form and shape, but they remain, right? Yeah. So this is how you get something like American exceptionalism, right? So even folks who employ that language today, including presidents from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I wonder if they know that you're drawing from like puritanical New England thinking, right, about what they felt was a theological project that has become a kind of political national identity, right, of how America sees itself in relationship to the rest of the world. But the reason why I point to that is because one of the ironies for me in that is that here you have the descendants of those who would describe themselves as products of the Reformation, right? Deeply, at this particular period, deeply Calvinistic themselves, who have this, you read kind of Puritan theological works, who have this profound sense of human depravity, human sinfulness, the insidiousness of the human heart, right? All these things, right? Yeah. Like there are jokes made about like Puritans like not being happy people, right? And yet, when the project turns into a project of nation building, what's at the center of that kind of national project is not corruption, right? It's innocence. I think that's so interesting, right? In other words, of people who espouse a kind of profound understanding of the depravity of humanity, its utter sinfulness, etc. But when they get together and have to build something in terms of national identity, when they get together and try to build something, the central ethos of that project is a kind of covenantal innocence that in many ways sanctions whatever activities and whatever, and the main activity that we could talk about here is the ways in which indigenous peoples and African peoples are treated. But that is all kind of sanctioned and bathed over because we're chosen, and God has given us and destined us for this kind of sanction and providential plan. Therefore, these things become kind of allowable, right? Right. But that's just one of the fundamental ironies. The reason why I bring this up and say all that to bring this up is the country has never fully reckoned with those concurrent train tracks that at once from the beginning there is the committing of these atrocious acts towards image bearers. And you can just kind of call the roll with kind of, on the actions and the things that are sanctioned. And yet you have that at the same time, another train track that is consistently saying what we're doing is right, what we're doing is pure, what we're doing is sanctioned, what we're doing is destined, what we're doing is divinely approved, right? Yeah. Both of those things have run concurrent through this country's history. And as you know, like, you can't just flatly make those two things compatible, right? They frustrate one another if one is not willing to be honest about one in favor of the other. Namely, well, in order to keep a particular national identity, I'm going to have to view national history in a particular kind of way that doesn't frustrate that national identity. We've been in a moment now that suggests no. We're not going to play that game anymore.
Right.
We're going to be honest about this history, and whatever that means about the national identity, we need to come to terms with it. And that fight, we're in the middle of that fight, right?
Yeah.
And what I want to suggest is, again, this is the one of the ironies of it. In many ways, you demonstrate that the national identity is suspect by your unwillingness to be honest about the history that runs concurrent with that identity, right?
Yeah.
In other words, you give away the game just by the way in which you're,
playing it,
by the way in which you're playing it, right?
Yeah.
But for those of us, again, who are theologically minded now in the present, and are trying to think about what faithfulness means, what is the status of the American church, where we come down in that fight is going to be important, right? And what I've seen in some quarters of the American church is a willingness to sacrifice what is at least ostensibly said to be known about humanity, about sinfulness, about the truth of what the gospel claims, etc., for the sake of this national identity, this national image, right? And I'm suggesting that when you make that kind of negotiation, you end up doing damage to the witness of the church writ large.
Yeah.
You cannot. We've been bequeathed that history, and so for those of us who are serious about the witness of, again, the church in this kind of context, we have to reckon with that history that we've been bequeathed. We can't act like that history has no bearing on how we hold the faith and how we commend the faith in this present moment, particularly given the kinds of critiques and the kinds of conversations that I know you've been in and that I find myself in all the time. It's one in which a kind of honesty and a humility is demanded.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say, man, before I let you jump in, because this is like sparking all kinds of stuff.
No, that's good.
Ultimately, right? Like, isn't that what we want? Ultimately, that who comes out looking good at the end of the narrative, right? Well, if it's nobody but God, isn't that the whole point, right? If nobody emerges with pristine hands, but right, if I don't emerge with pristine hands, right, or the nation doesn't emerge with pristine, pure hands, right, like to conclude that then that is an undermining of the faith doesn't make sense, right? Given what we espouse the faith to be.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, so let's stay there for a little bit and talk more about the ironies of American religious history. And you kind of already elaborated on some, but and we don't have to do the whole list, I know, but there's too much information currently available to still be playing this game. That's kind of how I look at it. Whereas there was some stuff in the past, maybe, historians, or maybe historians do, but they were probably the only ones who knew as far as what really happened in Reconstruction, what was the real ethos, who read the primary sources. And so now, thanks to the internet, or maybe not so much, we have books on shelves, but that's like a thing of the past now. So but there is a lot of information available at the fingertips. So therefore, when certain groups present themselves or play this game a certain way, everybody's like, man, we know that's false.
Right.
And so rather than simply say, you know what, you're right, the history is what it is, but we're going to choose to believe in America and move forward. Okay, fair enough. But to deny the history today, you've subverted your own position, because no one's going to take you seriously, because there's just too much evidence at this point. So rather than double down essentially on whatever the position is, Calvinism, Americanism, national, whatever it is, whatever your thing is, rather than simply say, you know what, you're right, let me walk this back a little bit. There's a lot of groups who doubled down and are doubling down and almost violently doubling down in spite of historical evidence. So is that a recent phenomenon? Is that the American history that that's how it started, that's how it is? Or where are we at with that?
Well, we've seen this tendency in the past, right? So even when you have current efforts, Well, if that's the position that you're going to take, then you're going to do all that you can. You're going to do all that you can to make sure that counter evidences are not available, whether they be in educational curriculums or on shelves at bookstores, right? Which is a very sad state of affairs, right? Yeah. But again, I'm always reminded of like how it works at the individual level with regard to sin, right? If I have shown that repentance is not the direction I'm walking towards, I'm not going to want to hear voices and realities and truths that push me in that direction. I'm going to want to muffle those sounds, right? So if I'm living in sin, and now it's I know when I see your name on my phone, you're going to always be. I'm not going to answer your call. I might delete you from my phone, right? But I don't want that in my presence because I'm committed to a particular way that's contrary to that, right? We're kind of seeing that kind of nationalized, right, with regard to this conversation of history, which to your point, I think is true. You end up, selling away whatever legitimate grounds you might have had in terms of witness, right? But no, we've seen this in the past. I mean, Du Bois wrote an entire book on Reconstruction in 1935, simply trying to tell the story of Reconstruction from a different vantage point, right? Because even at that point, what was being said in terms of national historical memory about Reconstruction was for him, and I think he was right, was just so wrong that he's like, no, I have to try to retell this story. And he has a chapter in there called The Propaganda of Truth, which he kind of gives he issues his own critique of history making in the country as it relates to the historical narrative around Reconstruction, and talks about the ways in which America will always appeal to the best versions of history that make itself look that results in itself looking more positive in the best light, versus being honest about the truth. And in many ways, he's echoing. This was something that Douglas even did.
Right. I was going to ask you about Douglas.
A century before. Right. He even has a line in his 4th of July speech. He says, I'm paraphrasing, when he says, America has this tendency to believe the set of facts that make it look the most favorable, right? Yeah.
And is that the same speech where he says that I can see nothing but the widest possible difference between the Christianity of the Bible and the Christianity of this land?
I believe so. Because he's doing a lot in that 4th of July speech. But again, for him, those two things go hand in hand, right? That inability to be honest about what was for him, not just history, but present realities, and certainly for Du Bois as well, speaks directly into the kind of Christian praxis and Christian imagination that's at work, right? With regard to, right, depending on how one is handling that kind of historical matter. And so for him, those two things are related in many ways. And I think that relation is present today, right? In other words, the kind of Christian imagination that is flowing from one who has this particular relationship with, I think, a false understanding of history, it makes sense, I guess, right? I am going to then manufacture an iteration of Christian faith that accords with the way in which I've decided to see and read history, which and it's not a history that is apart from the religious history of my own tradition, right? It's the way in which I'm reading Christian history in America, right? I'm going to make sure that my current faith practice and belief accords with this particular historical narrative that I've committed myself to. Yeah. So this is a repetition in many ways. We've seen this before.
Man, well, as you say that, we just talked about history is doomed to repeat itself if we don't learn from it. So with what you just said, and where you said we're seeing this again, it's pardon the expression, same crap, different toilet.
Yeah.
Well, how do we short circuit this cycle, or can we? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there's always been, right, a counter narrative. There's always been a perspective from the margins, or what we might call from the underside. The Black church tradition, the Black church is not a monolith at all. There's always been a diversity of belief, religious belief within the Black community in America. But at its best, and particularly thinking about the history of what we've come to call the Black church as a kind of sociological shorthand, has been one of the sites that has been a carrier of a kind of counter narrative, a kind of commitment to keep at the forefront, in the face of the country, an honest reckoning with its both historical and contemporary actions for the sake of accountability and for the sake of, what has always been the hope, not just liberation and spiritual renewal and vitality and fortification for the Black community, but at its best has been that hope has been held out for the national community, right? Yeah. King is not merely talking about, or put it this way, his vision always extends in, through, and beyond the parameters of the Black community, holding it out to be taken up by the national community, right? It's a vision that is for the flourishing of this entire national experiment, beginning with how we treat the Black community in particular, right? In the moment that he's serving. So, but I say there's always been this kind of counter narrative. I have since been playing around with the concept of fugitivity.
Explain that to me.
Yeah. It's been taken up as kind of a category of analysis in some corners of Black studies, drawn on a figure like Douglass. Douglass escaped slavery in the South, escapes to the North. He is, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, he is in violation, right? He is a fugitive, but it's a kind of fugitive status that doesn't result in the kind of actions you would think would be taken by someone who's quote unquote on the run. Douglass escapes from slavery, and he doesn't go into hiding for the rest of his life.
Right.
He becomes one of the most photographed Black people of the century in which he's living. He is publicly committing himself to particular acts in the midst of his own violation that's calling into question the legitimacy of the peculiar institution itself, right? That kind of idea has been taken up, right? This idea of being an escapee of, on the run from what is considered to be legitimate, what is considered to be legal, what is considered to be orthodox, what is considered to be standard and normative. It is a conscious willingness to be on the run from that, but not on the run in hiding, but on the run in public, so that I am now publicly trying to live into what is an alternative to that which I've run from. And so the people have taken that up as kind of, as called a kind of fugitivity. And so I've been thinking about it in terms of, the predicament of the American church. What does it mean? Again, using the Black church as a kind of historical example. But what does it mean to, I call it a kind of Black evangelical fugitivity? What does it mean to come to the conclusion that what is being called the normative standards of orthodoxy, whether that's theological, social, or political practice, etc., what is being called normative, I'm concluding that is actually not the standard, ought not be the standard. And I'm actually going to try and live out in public, in community, with others who made similar conclusion, a kind of different way of living the faith, commending the faith, talking about how the faith then implies me to do other things and empowers me to do other things socially, etc., as a kind of demonstration of that conclusion. It is a to be more provocative with it, it's a willingness to go heretic when I've concluded that the standards of orthodoxy that structure heresy are illegitimate. So I'm going heretic for the sake of actually reclaiming true orthodoxy.
Right.
But I'm willing to take on the status of quote unquote unorthodox for the sake of that project. Right. So Douglas, I'm a fugitive, but in my fugitivity, I'm actually making an argument that that whole fugitive relationship is illegitimate because the system is wrong.
Yeah.
That can be a hard choice, right? Depending on what your relationship is to that normative standard and structure that is currently structuring what orthodoxy and heresy looks like, right?
Yeah.
But what I found is that there's go back to biblical language, right? There's you're not alone, I guess put it that way, right? Yeah. I have thousands who have not bowed the knee, right? Yeah. I've just found that there's always those who are thinking likewise, who find the current status quo unsettling, and are trying to come in a different way from the margins.
No, that's really good. Are you familiar with Isaiah Robertson?
Yeah.
He does a lot of work in this area.
So yeah, there's a lot of folks who I think are working on that project, right? I'm thinking theoretically about if I have to describe what that is. I'm trying to theorize that.
I'm just talking about the research done in that area by him and others, and you as well. And I think in his first book, he talked about the early Black church kind of functioning as an apologetic against the American church at the time. Not to say a better, or I know whoever's listening, that's not saying it's a better thing. It's just saying they were trying to bring us all back to the idea of what's actually in the Declaration of Independence, even though we didn't live by it, even as it was being written.
Yeah.
But the Black church initially was trying to bring everybody back to the idea of the Imago Dei for every type of people, not just for certain people. And so that is theologically orthodox.
Yeah.
Though it wasn't the law of the land at the time.
Right.
And you're kind of saying that, okay, these are the rules that we've been given to play by. But Douglas and others are saying, well, the game had bad rules. And so I'm not trying to be antagonistic. I'm just saying I want to play by the right rules.
Right. My playing by the right rules, though, looks like or can be read, will often be rendered legible as me being a rule breaker. Right. As me transgressing the boundaries of the proper relationship between Christianity and politics, me transgressing the normative boundaries between, the proper relationship between Christianity and public life or just Christian orthodoxy itself, period, right? I'm transgressing, I'm outside of the bounds, right? It'll often be read like that. You have to come to terms with your relationship with being read like that. Because that's the temptation, right? I can stay within the boundaries that's set, and be read as rightly ordered, and yet still in my own conscience know that I'm kind of wrongly ordered, or I can make certain conscious decisions to try to live out a more healthier faith praxis.
Yeah, well, that's good. Thank you for that. Just one more question. What are some of the sociopolitical constraints or impositions on what we can call Black theological conservatism? And just so everybody's clear, we're talking about theologically conservative, not politically.
Yeah.
Because even that idea has changed over the history. That's not what this show's about. But anyway, theologically, throughout the history of Africans or African Americans in this country, there's been significant challenges, but up to and including today, what are some of the socio-political constraints and impositions that either hindered or helped Black theological conservatism?
Yeah, I mean, and you're right. I think it's important to even say a little bit about the categories themselves that have become increasingly problematic, right?
Yeah.
Theological conservatism has been demonstrated to be conflated in many ways with political conservatism in our contemporary politics, right? And it's been like that for a while.
Right.
that kind of conflation, right, has meant a number of things for the world of politics, but even more importantly for the American church. So to even suggest a theological conservatism that even to categorize as theologically conservative brings in all of that baggage, right?
Yeah.
But it's my way to try to capture what has often been a surprise or a shock to some who are kind of removed from this kind of world. That when you kind of dig into the ecclesiological arrangement of many Black churches, even if you're talking about Black churches that are themselves under the main historic Black denominations. When you look at the doctrine and theology of many of these institutions and the churches that align with them, we might find ourselves in want of better categorization. But there is a kind of theological conservatism operative, right? It often looks different.
Right.
It sounds different. The implications that flow from it are different. And we can kind of, we can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
What makes it a challenge and why that's often surprising to people is because that renders that community in particular, maybe opposition is the best language. You can't settle it into a binary. You don't know where to fit it. You know where to place it. Depending on what kind of, what you're talking about, politics, what you're talking about, social realities, it makes it hard to kind of situate it. It's only because what do you do because of that? And I think what we're seeing right now, if you take the world of politics, you don't even have to take politics though. The kind of burden and pressure is for the community to nevertheless resort itself into the binary system, right? And make choice of in ways that cause it to transgress its own commitments, right? So in other words, how does the community live into, in a nuanced way, their peculiarity when they're constantly being forced to situate themselves within binaries that binary categories that, one, don't serve the community, and two, that they didn't come up with themselves, right? And that's always been the kind of one of the imposed constraints, right? I didn't come up with these categories. These categories don't serve my community. And yet, in order to be visible, in order to be rendered legible, in order to have some legitimate, presence in this system, I have to resort myself into these kind of spaces, right?
Yeah. You got to fake it to make it sometimes.
Yeah, man. And so, what does it mean to, right? Like, how does that community begin to think otherwise about that predicament? And that's a challenge. And because what's at stake for me in that is thinking again just about the category of Black religion. Part of the reason why I've committed myself to this program and I want to see it through is, yes, I care about the historical work that I'm doing in early, the early period and the thinkers that I'm writing about. But in terms of the category of Black religion and some other theoretical work that I'm invested in, I'm glad we got here. I'm concerned that for the Black church in particular, I'm concerned that the categories of resistance and accommodation. So I'm gonna kind of go back into my research for a second. Or we might say, I'm concerned that the ever-present and ongoing cause of reckoning with the vicious legacy of slavery and white supremacy and their institutional and structural realities that are residues into the present moment and beyond, reckoning with that reality, I'm concerned that can play an over-determining role in how Black religious identity sees itself and how Blackness is kind of rendered legible. In other words, I'm concerned with how do I give attention to the ongoing problem that stuff I just named is, without allowing Blackness and Black religion to be totalizingly defined by that stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like that's part of the task of the moment.
It is. I always my phrase is we always overswing the pendulum. You know, in 2020, you know, before everything happened, and then everything happened, and then the reaction was correction, but overcorrection to the point, to me, at least in my estimation, that some of the what some people would call woke policies and ideology, it has gone too far, way too far, way farther than most Black people ever wanted to take it. To be honest with you, they didn't ask us, but
didn't ask us.
They just did
that's another conversation.
Oh yeah.
Another conversation.
Well, I mean, maybe real briefly then, because we're talking about socio-political constraints and impositions. This is a bigger conversation, but real briefly, one of those impositions, in my estimation, you could tell me historically, is something can start within Black culture or Black churches or Black spaces. And see, I don't know another way to say it, because white liberals tend to hijack that. And when it morphs, it causes a reaction that hurts Black people. But Black people weren't the ones that took it to that level. You know what I'm saying? So the pushback now, the reactionary pushback against African Americans or minorities for wokeism, when we didn't, that wasn't us. You know, and so like, how does that imposition? How do we circumvent that?
I mean, there's been this, you know, I have a lot of friends who do work in this space. You know, the category of allyship. I often, you know, it's not funny in many ways, but I often have this running joke with regard to white progressives and their desire to be allies to the Black community. And, you know, you'll always see these kind of like efforts, whether it's demonstrations or performative actions or even policy positions taken. And it's like, yeah, we ain't asked you to do all that. We didn't actually do all that. We just asked you to, you know, have a hard conversation with your uncle, or, you know, that, I mean, literally, like,
no, you're right.
You know, we asked you to, you know, stand up for and you know, use whatever privilege and position and status you have to, like, that was the conversation, and you went and did all this other stuff. And as a way to say, right, that's good. And it was like, yeah, we didn't even actually do all that. And so then again, right, like, what does it mean for? And so in light of that, I feel like the pressure, the imposition for the community then is to look at that and sanction and thumbs up it all, right? Like, yes, this is exactly what we wanted, right? That's the kind of burden and pressure, right? What does it mean to assertively say, no, actually, that's not quite it. What we had in mind is somewhat different. It's in accordance with certain principles and convictions, etc. And those aren't going to be, you know, universally held across the board by Black Americans. But I am suggesting that there is this, I feel like, this moment we're in where that tension is increasingly felt. And I feel like there are a lot of folks who are asking rightly, how do I kind of reject that imposition and actually advocate for what is seen to be a healthier way, and for Christians what is seen to be a more faithful way. That's the challenge. That is the challenge.
It's almost it's kind of like, you know, if growing up you're on the playground or whatever, and somebody is coming at you and you don't really want to fight. You're trying to kind of like, okay, let me just get out of here. Let me live to fight another day, or walk away. But you got your friend with you, and your friend's the hype man, and your friend starts popping off at the mouth, to the point that this potential enemy, the person you didn't really want to get into it with, now you have to.
Now you got to.
And that's kind of how I look at this sometimes. Like, look, it's hard enough already. I'm not trying to get in more fights. I want to be accurate. I want to push back when necessary. But after that, I just want to go home. That's most Black people. Like, we don't need extra fights.
That's exactly right.
You got your hype man, and now we're being embroiled in stuff that we didn't start, or at least I feel like that for myself sometimes.
Yeah. And what is at stake too is the not just the legacy, but the future. I think we don't have time to unpack this, but just how we tell the narrative of not just Black religion, but specifically Black church, Black Christianity is critical, because I think what often gets lost, because the functionalist role is so important. You think of like the Skip Gates PBS documentary, The Black Church. Mm-hmm. Great documentary, but you can clearly see that the kind of functionalist role of Black religion is kind of over determining the narrative, right? Yeah. What is Black religion doing for Black people in order to combat XYZ? Legitimate question. That will always be a legitimate question, because again, of the history we've been bequeathed, and the present and the future that we will be inhabiting. And yet Black religion is more than simply its functionalist role in giving and resourcing the Black community against the legacies and the structure. It's more than that. It does that, but it's more than that. Right. So how do we capture a more capacious understanding of Black Christian faith and praxis for the moment and for the future, right? I think that's critical. That's going to be essential, actually, and in ways that are consistent with history. That recapturing and that capacious and more robust understanding is going to be vital for, I think, whatever possibility this experiment, this democratic experiment, has. To your point, whether it's fair or not, I often feel like whatever future this experiment might have, if it's salvageable, it's always only ever been an experiment, meaning this democracy. It won't surprise me if Black Christian communities have an oversized role to play in that in the positivity of that future, and in light of public witness of the American church more broadly. We talked about that, and credibility being at the low level that it is in certain Christian communities. That wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, me neither. Well, man, I'm so glad we did this. This is so rich. I got to go rewatch it and get my history right. But thank you so much for joining me. And is there anything else you want to say as far as what you're working on, what you got coming up next?
I'm trying to just, this dissertation is mainly what I'm trying to focus on. I'm trying to do it justice and give attention to both the historical work that I mentioned with regard to the figures that I spoke of, but then also this theoretical work. And so I'm trying to hold space to get that project done. I still do my work at Georgetown and some other places. So I'm still probably saying yes to other projects here and there, but I'm trying to get this writing done and to hopefully see what flows from it. So,
amen. Well, we will keep an eye out for that, and for all your work. I mean, you've done so much already, but thank you for doing the hard work, the hard research, the hard investigation for the rest of us. Yeah, I appreciate it. If you're all watching, make sure you share this with somebody you think it could help and benefit. And until next time, peace.